So in case there's a few parts of this that are a little disjointed, please forgive me. I've been deploying a bunch of websites over the past week, and I think I've gotten an average of 3 or 4 hours of sleep. And B, this presentation, I gave it a couple times before, but I wanted to touch it up now that some things have changed with Drupal VM. And it was also kind of late notice because we had a speaker cancel, so I said, I'll do that, in addition to the other 100 things I had this week. But I hope that it'll be useful and helpful. Sometimes I compare Drupal VM to a Swiss Army knife because it has a lot of different functions that are helpful for debugging something in Drupal or building something or testing performance or all those kind of things. But I think that a better analogy is a Leatherman, because a Swiss Army knife, it can do all those things, but it's not going to be very fun for most of them. It's just nice to have it there. A Leatherman, on the other hand, it has a needle nose pliers that's actually pretty good, and a pretty good knife, and a pretty good little saw. And it has all that built into it. And so I usually use that analogy a little bit more with Drupal VM. Everything in this presentation will be online, the video from it and the slides and everything. But if you want to follow along in the documentation, there's a couple sections I'll be talking about. Also, the code is on GitHub. Just search for Drupal VM or go to drupalvm.com. You can get there. And the documentation is pretty thorough. So if there's something I don't cover today, which there's probably about 600 features that I'm not going to talk about, search it in the documentation site and you might find it. Pretty much anything that you're going to do in your Drupal development lifecycle, Drupal VM can help with it. So one question that I'm asked sometimes is, what's the quickest way I can use Drupal VM to start doing something with Drupal? And like, let's say you're at a sprint and you have a patch and you want to test the core patch. Or you just want to make sure, you want to get a screenshot for a presentation of something that Drupal does. The quickest way is actually, here's another slide. You can use Docker now with Drupal VM, and it will basically create a new Drupal VM instance in less than 1/10 of a second, assuming you've downloaded it. If you haven't, it takes maybe 30 seconds to download it. But I'll do this right now. And then Drupal VM has right now just one or two helper scripts. One of them is install Drupal. And so no matter what version of Drupal you want, 8, 7, you could technically do 6. I don't know how it works with like PHP 7.1, but you just run this command after you bring up the Docker container, and you'll have an instance. So to prove this, I haven't actually tested this today. Or actually never, I just put this slide in about 10 minutes ago. Let's see if that actually works. It would be helpful if I had Docker running. So let's do that. And the nice thing about Docker is it works on Mac, Windows, and Linux pretty equally. There's a couple caveats. One is with the way that you're used to, if you've used Drupal VM or something like a Vagrant VM before, it can manage your host file for you, and it can connect all the networking stuff together. Docker is not quite up to that level. There are ways to do that, but they either involve a lot of extra containers and management, or more knowledge it's just not as usable for the simple out-of-the-box setup with like a local domain name as something like Vagrant. So now that Docker's running, I'll run this command again, and it has an instance of Drupal VM. If I go to localhost, it's going to not find anything because I haven't installed Drupal yet. So let's run the other command to install Drupal, docker exec Drupal VM install Drupal. And now it's going to download Drupal. Hopefully the Wi-Fi here is fast. It's not looking like it yet. Hopefully I have a connection. Yeah, that's working. Let me check my Docker settings. Sometimes Docker for Mac and Windows, I haven't seen this as much on Linux. Sometimes the DNS settings don't really work, and so it just sits there and does nothing. But you'll just have to trust me that works, because apparently Docker's DNS is not playing nice right now. But the other nice thing is you can install any Drupal version too. So if you wanted a Drupal 7.56 site to play around with, you can do that. And it's not going to download it, of course. Or if you wanted like the development version, like let's say you're at a code sprint or you're testing your module against the latest version of Drupal, you can do 8.4.x, and that'll download the latest development release of Drupal 8.4, which is just about to be released. So that's pretty useful. I use that quite often to when I'm doing patch testing or when I'm working on my modules. If I'm updating something or adding a new feature, I always want to test it in a fresh environment. So that's a quick way to get that. But you'll just have to trust me that that works, assuming Docker is not having any DNS issues. Let me kill that container. Okay, and we'll keep moving on. So, a lot of times you actually want to do work and get paid for it, so you can't just be testing patches and doing community things. But a lot of times you just need something quick and easy to use for local development. So I have maybe 10 or 12 sites that are either personal sites that I run or sites that I help small businesses or friends or nonprofits with. And I don't really need a super custom environment with XHProf for debugging and Tideways for code profiling. I just need to be able to run Drupal. And they have their code base, and I have my local environment. So Drupal VM also works in that case with the same Docker image that I just was showing earlier. You can use it with an existing code base if you just grab Drupal VM's Docker Compose file. If you download that, put it in your site's root folder, and then run Docker Compose up -d to put in the background. Then it will start up a Docker container running your local environment with your code base shared inside of it. And this used to be really slow about 6 months ago, last time that I started working on this. And luckily, in the time between then, Docker for Mac has added a feature where it will synchronize files a lot faster. It used to be with Drupal 8 where there's thousands of files. It used to take like 12 to 14 seconds per page load. Now it's a lot faster. So I actually use this for a lot of my local projects, as I was saying. One of those is Hosted Apache Solr. So Hosted Apache Solr is a hosted Solr search service for Drupal. In case you would like it, you can sign up for it. But a lot of times I need to test something or test to change the payment gateway or something like that. So I need a local environment for it. And what I can do, I put it in my README for the site. But basically I grabbed Drupal VM's Docker Compose, which is right here. And I don't think I had to make any changes for this site. I think all I changed was this IP address because I have a unique IP address per environment. I did this, and then there's also a command to run. Let's see, do I have it in here? If you're on Mac, you have to run one extra command to tell your Mac to send requests for that IP address to Docker. I think that's a networking issue that'll be fixed in the next 6 months to a year, but timelines are always a little bit iffy with Docker. Anyway, so I grabbed this Docker Compose out of Drupal VM. I put it in my project, and in my project I have all my Drupal files under a web directory. You can do this in different ways, but Drupal VM by default will use web because that's the kind of the way that the Drupal project uses for when it builds a composer-based project template. If you have it in a folder called dockroot or something, you can make a symbolic link. You can look that up on Google if you need to. A symbolic link from web to dockroot or web to whatever folder Drupal is in. It just has to be, there has to be a web directory in the same folder as the Docker Compose. But if I run Docker Compose up, then it'll build the networking for it so that I have it on that IP address. And then after 5 or 10 seconds doing that, it'll bring up the containers. And all right, so it brought up the containers, and then if I go to local.drupal, or what is it, hosted apache solr.test, And of course, Google doesn't think that's a domain name because Google's silly. I used to use .dev, but Google bought out the dev domain, whatever, the root domain. So now I can't use dev for anything because that breaks everything. So I use test, and then I always get redirected to Google search. So if I go there, that should load my local site. And since this is a brand new install, it doesn't have my site database. So I actually put a couple shortcuts into my README that I can copy and paste. This one grabs the database from production. I'll grab that. And then I have another command that will import the database. And, oh, that's interesting. So I must have messed something up in my settings. I was changing this up to about 2 minutes ago, so I probably changed something in my settings file that's gonna break this connection. But basically, I can pull in my database, and then I'll have my local environment, and it'll come up and look just the same as hosted ApacheSolar.com. So that's another way you can use Drupal VM. And like I said, I use that for almost all my personal sites, but it doesn't offer a lot of flexibility. Because right now the Drupal VM Docker image is kind of a fat image that has everything on it. It has MySQL and PHP and Apache and all these other things. And you can technically kind of squish it around to get it different, but it's not very easy. So a lot of people need more customization. Let me go back over here. A lot of people need more complex environments, or they need a lot of tools for local testing, or they need to do something where it integrates with a proxy server somewhere. All these different things that require a lot more flexibility than what the basic Docker image can offer. And right now, the answer is that you would want to use Drupal VM with Vagrant because it's pretty reliable, bulletproof. A lot of people are using it for so many different reasons. And some of the requirements I see all the time are like, somebody has Apache Solar Search, and in the Docker world, there's like hundreds of images that have Apache Solar 6, because that's been the latest version now for like a year. But a lot of Drupal hosting providers are on like Drupal or on Solar 1 or Solar 3 or Solar 4. So a lot of people are like, well, I need Solar, and I can't use 6 because everything breaks if I try using 6, and it's not matching my production environment. So I need 3.6. With Drupal VM, you can do that. Or let's say you need Elasticsearch, which is similar to Solar. It uses Lucene and all that. Drupal VM can add that. It can add Varnish, Xdebug, Blackfire for profiling. You can run PHP 7.2, 7.1, 7.0, 5.6, and up until a month or two ago, 5.5. Actually, you can still do that in a hacky way, but I don't recommend it. And you can switch up databases. You can use Postgres or MySQL or what's the tiny database thing that's just a file? SQLite. You can use SQLite. You can also switch web servers and use Nginx instead of Apache if you want to. A lot of my production servers use Nginx, so most of their configurations I set up through Drupal VM using Nginx, because there are some differences that will happen when you're using Nginx versus Apache. The main idea is you want your local environment to match production as identically as possible, because there are large classes of errors and bugs and features that work differently if you're using a generalized stack, if you're using something like Dev Desktop or MAMP or WAMP or something. So Drupal VM lets you tune everything exactly how you like it. And if you want to use Drupal VM in that way, the way that you do that is you install VirtualBox and Vagrant. It actually works with other providers besides VirtualBox, but that's the most tested and reliable. And then you download Drupal VM from drupalvm.com, or I'll show you another way that you can use it later that's a little bit more modern. And then you customize a config.yaml file. And the nice thing is that just like in Drupal, using YAML for configuration, you can actually like read and set configuration values just by looking at them. It's really easy to do. It's the same way with Drupal. You can change things like PHP memory limit, MySQL, connect timeout, any kind of parameter that you need to. There's a YAML parameter for it that you change. And then to bring it up, you run Vagrant up. And that's standard across any Vagrant box type thing. Vagrant, I think, just released 2.0 just a few days ago. but it's been around for years and it's super stable. If it were using Google Chrome's numbering scheme, it'd probably be on like version 280 or something. And then once you have it running, Drupal VM builds a dashboard page for you that kind of can be your jumping off point. You don't have to use this page. Once you get your site set up, you might have the local environment and some other things already like pre-set up, so you don't have to go through the dashboard. But it's nice to have. And so over in this window, I already brought up an environment, because it takes, one reason why I put this one third is it takes like 5 to 10 minutes to build, as opposed to the Docker container, which takes less than a second to build. Or if you use Docker Compose, it might take like 30 seconds. So it's more heavyweight, but there's a ton more flexibility. And it manages your host file for you. So if you put your project name in here like local.mysite.com, it will put that into your host file. So you don't have to ever edit your host file by hand. It's super convenient. And you also don't have to have like an entire DNS server running locally with Docker to manage all these different things. It's pretty flexible and works on Windows, Linux, and Mac equally. So if I go to the dashboard page, let me get back to my browser. It brings up a little dashboard that, in case you don't have it working correctly with your host file, you could copy these out and paste them in your host file. Now there's also a docs link right here, and then it gives you all the information you need to start working with it. So all the hosts that you can have multiple Drupal sites. You could have 10 code bases and 100 sites on them. For one of my projects, I have seven domains and one Drupal root using multi-site. So all of those are listed here, and I can click off to them. It also tells me where it is inside the VM and what drush alias to use. So those are nice and helpful. It also gives you MySQL connection information. So if you want to debug something in the database, you can use a tool like SQL Pro or MySQL Workbench. Get all the details here. And then there's also all the built-in tools and links to get to the different components of Drupal VM. So on this particular Drupal VM instance, I have Adminer, Mailhog, PimpMyLog, and Solar. Adminers, who here has heard of PHPMyAdmin? Okay, so most people. Who here has heard of Adminer? So a couple. So it's lesser known, but it's actually a lot nicer in my opinion, just because it's faster. The code is smaller. It's a little bit easier, in my opinion, to secure it. And the project is all about simplicity. So it's basically a local MySQL interface. And Drupal VM by default uses Drupal, which is also the words to the Drupal song. And it gives you a nice little view of your database. And you can turn it off if you don't want it by just, in your config.yaml, take it out of your installed extras, and it won't be there. But it's nice to have it because not every time do I want to have to configure my SQL Pro to connect to some new Drupal VM instance. So that's there. There's also Mailhog. The cool thing here is that it will, any emails, by default, any emails sent inside of Drupal VM will go straight into Mailhog. So most people, when you're in a development environment, you don't want your emails from that test environment going out to real people on the internet, because you might be debugging something, or it might be me about 7 years ago sending a test email and accidentally sending that test email to about 100,000 people from my local computer, and then having to spend the next few days apologizing and trying to make it so that the few people that were offended didn't not sign up for your service and you lose money. So Mailhog will catch any emails that Drupal sends, or anything in PHP, and then it'll give it in a nice inbox format here. You can switch that off if you need to, but out of the box it comes kind of configured for that safety. And then it also has PimpMyLog, which it's a logging interface, so that instead of having to log into the VM and tail logs, you can watch them in here. It takes a little bit of time to set up correctly, and I don't really use it that much because I'm used to tailing logs in the terminal, but some people really like it. So there it is. Then of course it comes with Solar. By default it'll have 5.5, but you can use Solar 6, you can use Solar 4, Solar 3, and it'll give you the dashboard for any of those versions. And it comes with, I think, one default core, the collection one core. There's also a script included with Drupal VM, because since Solr is so popular, there's a script that's included that sets up Drupal VM just for the Search API Solr module in Drupal 8, so that you can kind of get bootstrapped really quickly. And then at the bottom, it gives you some PHP information. You can also get PHP info really quick, just to confirm that you have the extensions you need installed, that kind of thing. And then it also lists all the databases. So this is just the general connection information, and then this will get you straight to the Drupal database, or you can, like I said, you can have multiple Drupal sites. And to do that, all you need to do, let me go back over here. In your configuration file, databases, there. You can add more than one database by just adding another item to this list. You can add multiple users using this list. Same thing for Postgres if you use Postgres. And this is how you control what's installed, the installed extras. I just added in Solr. It also comes with Varnish. Actually, I don't think Varnish is turned on by default, but a lot of people end up using Varnish for page caching, and so it's pretty easy to get that up and running too. And a cool thing is that with the way Drupal VM works out of the box, Varnish will work with BigPipe and what is the other, cache tags in Drupal 8. And if you're like me and you have always been interested in performance and speed, and you see how powerful that can be to have BigPipe and cache tags working together on a Drupal 8 site, there's a few of the sites that I'm building where every page load is less than 30 to 40 milliseconds. Even if it's like, I usually use the New York data center, and it's almost instant with Varnish and Drupal 8. And when it clears a page from the cache, or when you update a node or something, it clears out just those pages immediately, and then the caches get rebuilt quickly. It's quite nice to see nowadays how well Varnish is integrated. You can also set, like, some people need a certain version of Drush. Like I know some people that still have Drupal 5 sites that they're building on this, and they need, I think, Drush 5 or 6 or 4. One of the versions, you have to go really old to get it. And also, another issue right now is Drupal 8.4 will not work with Drush 8, I don't think, at least in the short term. So if you're going to be using the latest version of Drupal, you'll need to update this to Drush 9. So it's nice to have that option to be able to change all these things. Anything in here that you change needs to be deployed into the VM. So if you want to add ports to the firewall, or if you want to add a second database and website, you would run Vagrant provision. And that will use Ansible to kind of reconfigure everything to the new defaults that you set up. And there's one or two things that you might need to actually like delete the VM and rebuild it from scratch. If you're like taking off certain software, or if you're trying to change Apache to Nginx and MySQL to Postgres and something else, you might need to run the command vagrant destroy to delete everything, and then vagrant up to build it again. I usually do that anyways, just because I like having a fresh environment without any of the clutter from the past. But as you can see, this takes a little longer. It's way more flexible, but it takes 3 minutes or so when it's updating stuff, and it takes 5 to 10 minutes when it's building it fresh. There's also another project called Beatbox, B-E-E-T-B-O-X, that's maintained by a guy who's in Australia, and he does basically Drupal VM but on steroids that's a little more tuned for speed. So when you're provisioning it, it only takes 1 or 2 minutes instead of 5 to 10. But it trades off a little bit of flexibility for that speed. So I would put it somewhere between the Docker solution and Drupal VM and Vagrant. So let's go back into the presentation. And I'm not going to focus on this too much today, but for the other presentations I gave, I focused a little more on how you can use Drupal VM in the entire life cycle of your project. Not only can Drupal VM build a local environment, you can actually use Drupal VM to build a test environment on the cloud somewhere, AWS or DigitalOcean or Linode or wherever. Or you can even build production servers using Drupal VM. There's a few security caveats. One is I'm not responsible for your security, but two is there's some settings that you want to make sure you override for production to turn off things like MySQL access anywhere, that kind of thing. And you probably want to change your password from Drupal to something secure. I recommend if you're building a new Drupal 8 site and you have to do anything that has any kind of complexity, like for instance adding an address field using the address field module, using Composer to build your site rather than either downloading everything by hand or using Drush. If you use Composer, things are put together a little bit more easily and things are easier to update. It's a little slower right now, which is kind of annoying. It takes maybe a minute or two to update a module instead of 10 seconds with Drush. But for certain parts of Drupal 8 now, it's becoming necessary to use Composer to download things because it has to download all these other third-party libraries that integrate with the Drupal modules. So in Drupal 8, I have a blog post about they're still, I call them strange bedfellows because there's some weird issues you get with Drupal, a super big legacy CMS, working with Composer, which is like a really modern PHP dependency tool. But some people have done a lot of work of making, like, kind of ironing out those wrinkles and smoothing out the road ahead. And they created this thing called Drupal Project, which is, in my opinion, the best way right now to set up a new Drupal 8 site. It requires a little bit of, I'd say a little more discipline in terms of how you work with modules and things, but this command will bring up a new project called Bacon, and inside the Bacon folder you'll have a web directory with your Drupal code base. You'll have a Docker file, or not a Docker file, a Composer file that tells your site what modules to use, and it has a Composer lock file which says the exact version to use, which is nice because sometimes with, like, a lot of people would use make files with Drush, and you would say, like, I want these 5 modules. But if a new developer came on and downloaded it, he'd download newer versions and things would break. You can specify versions in make files, but it's just kind of a messy solution. Composer lets you do things like, say, Composer update Drupal honeypot, and that will update the honeypot module, but nothing else. So this is how you set up the site. And then if you set up your site that way, Drupal VM is actually a Composer project too. It's on Packagist. So if you want to add a VM to your existing code base and you use Composer already, you just say Composer required dev Geerling guide Drupal VM. And what the dev does is it says this is a development dependency. And if you're using Composer completely the right way, I know there was a session about Jenkins before this one. If you're using something like Jenkins to build your code base for production, it's a best practice, but it's impractical for a lot of people, so I don't say that you have to do it that way. But if you do, you can say, when you build the production code, don't include Drupal VM. Like, why would you want to include Drupal VM on your production Drupal site? That's kind of silly. You want Drupal VM in your development environment, and if you want to, you can also use Drupal VM to build your production environment. But you don't want Drupal VM in your production environment. It's the same thing for things like the devel module. You wouldn't run that in production, but you can require dev, and it will put it just on your local environment. And then the next step is you'd want to change a few of these settings. If you're using Drupal VM with Drupal Project or Drupal 8 Composer-based project. And then you also want to pick what things that you want installed on the VM. If you're going to use Drupal VM for production, you'd probably want to remove Mailhog and remove Drupal console, unless you need it for something in production. Remove Xdebug and add Varnish, and maybe any other tools that you'd use in production. And then also, if you're using, right now there's this kind of messy step where you have to add a Vagrant file into your project's root folder. It's a manual, annoying process. We can actually do this automatically, but I need to convert Drupal VM entirely to a Composer project, and I don't want to do that yet because a lot of people still download it. But for now, you have to basically stick this file inside your project's doc root so that Vagrant knows what to do. And then you run Vagrant up. So there's a couple more steps involved if you use Composer for everything, but it will automatically let you keep Drupal VM up to date, and it'll help you protect against hacking things, kind of like don't hack core. You should also not hack Drupal VM's code. You should override things in your configuration files. And it looks like I have some more time, so I have an example and then a couple other notes too. One thing that Drupal VM also includes is the ability to run bhat tests out of the box. This actually has just changed a little bit because we have now headless Chrome, which just came out like a month or two ago. And so all the stuff I had written up for Drupal VM, all the documentation covers like Phantom.js, or what was the other project it used? I don't remember, like Firefox something. Yeah, Selenium. It still uses Selenium with headless Chrome, but it was different web drivers that it was using. And now, since headless Chrome came out, and the Phantom.js maintainer's like, I'm not going to maintain this anymore, now I need to change some of the documentation to make sure that it works correctly. But this would work. Actually, this slide I didn't update it, but BLT, which is a project that Acquia makes, actually configures bhat for you out of the box, which is really nice. So if you need an example of a test that works out of the box, look at Acquia BLT. And it has in its code base all the code that you need. You just grab it out of there, put it in your project. But this is how a bhat test looks. And if you have Drupal VM and a BLT project, or a project that uses the same kind of setup with bhat and the headless driver, then it will run tests for you. And I think in the Jenkins presentation that was just done, an example of using bhat was given. You can use Drupal VM in that process, or you can use bhat directly. The nice thing with Drupal VM is in your local environment, you can tune it exactly how you need it, and you can have some scripts and aliases to help you with this stuff. Or in the case of BLT, BLT uses PHP Robo, which is an automation library for PHP, and it uses Robo to run all these tests. So you can run a command like BLT test, and it will do all your tests for you. And then a point that some people have a lot of battle scars over. I don't even use Windows as a daily computer environment, but I have a lot of scars from it, from trying to help other people with it. A lot of times Windows users are kind of left out in the cold because a lot of tools, a lot of open source software, a lot of developers don't even have Windows because they don't pay for the license to get a Windows copy. And a lot of them don't enjoy using it for various reasons, whether it's the open source mentality, or they got a Mac and it's easier to not have Windows running on it, or who knows what. But the basic point is, a lot of times Windows users don't have as good an experience onboarding with Drupal and with other tools. Drupal VM is, I wouldn't say it's like Windows first, but it definitely has a strong emphasis on its Windows compatibility, both with Docker and with the Vagrant VM. There's a lot of little features in Drupal VM that make it easier to run on Windows, and there's also a lot of documentation for how to make it run faster on Windows, because the defaults for most of these Vagrant projects, you end up with a really slow Windows environment. Windows is fine, but like the VM is running very slow. So in the documentation, I linked to a few blog posts I have too about how you can use Drupal VM to kind of be a wrapper around your Drupal project, or you can have Drupal VM be part of your Drupal project, or you can have Drupal VM in a Docker container. All of them making it so that on Windows you don't have as painful of an experience getting things running and testing things and doing performance testing. And these are a few of those tips for how you can make the Windows experience a little less painful. There's tons of information in the documentation, so I'd recommend going there if you use Windows, or if you're helping somebody with Windows with Drupal VM. And then these are a few other notes that I just wanted to call out, because there's things that some people don't know that exist with Drupal VM. One is the Docker documentation. I covered it in the beginning of this presentation. If I had more than a minute or two to spend working on the example, I would have fixed that DNS issue and you would have seen it, and then I would have gotten a lot more applause, I guess. But there's good Docker integration right now. I wouldn't call it best in breed or anything, because I'm still playing around and experimenting with Docker. I actually just started running Docker in production with PHP and Apache on a project I'm working on in the past month. And so I've seen a lot more of like what works, what doesn't work, and I'm still kind of on the fence right now, waiting to see what the best solution will be for local development with Docker for a complex application like Drupal. Right now, Drupal VM is kind of one big container holding everything, and that's kind of against the Docker ethos, but it works, so I use it. And then on the other side, there's some projects where there's 25 Docker containers you're bringing up, and Docker it's just like VirtualBox, except faster, and the technology is a little bit different underlying it, but it's a virtualized thing that runs things. And sometimes people have too much complexity, and then when you have a problem, you can't just Google the solution because you're like, well, I have these 7 containers and 2 of them aren't connecting and something's weird, and I have a proxy server on my corporate network and I can't do this. That kind of thing happens all the time, and I think in the next year or two, those kind of things will be sorted out, and at that time I might move more of Drupal VM towards Docker. I already have a couple images, one for Solar and a couple that have Ansible on them that I'm using for different things, but I don't have like an ecosystem around Drupal VM that works that way. There are a few others like Wadby, Drucker, something like that. There's a few other ones from other companies and other individuals that are pretty good, and I'd recommend them if you really want to go down the Docker path. But it's still a maturing ecosystem, whereas Vagrant has been around for years and years. There's also a way that you can override any Vagrant setting. You can create a Vagrant file.local file inside your root folder, and you can override any setting. Like if you really wanted to, you could not use Ansible to provision it. Ansible is the thing that builds everything. It builds PHP and MySQL and all that. If you wanted to, you could use some other tool. But you could also change things like networking settings, or if you have a special plugin that works for your corporate environment and does something, you could configure it in there. Another thing that some people ask is like, I love everything about it, but I have this one whatever tool that I need, and it's not configured out of the box with Drupal VM. Well, there's a couple ways that you can add in other things. One is you can add extra packages, and it will install those extra packages during the provisioning. So if you just need like a networking tool or some performance tool that's in a package on Ubuntu or CentOS or whatever OS you're using, you just add it to that list. There's also the option of adding scripts, shell scripts, or Ansible task include files, which in some ways they're the similar thing, except Ansible uses YAML and you can use Ansible modules, which is powerful, whereas shell script, it's just bash. But you can create one and drop it into your project and then refer to it in your configuration, and then Drupal VM will run that script or run that Ansible task file as part of the provisioning process. And you can have it run either before or after provisioning. So some people need to use that for specialized proxy settings if they have a really locked down network and they need to repoint all the internal stuff at something else. Or it could be something as simple as you have a really weird custom Solar setup or Elasticsearch, and you need to move around a couple files. You can do that on your own, and Drupal VM will pick that up and do it. There's also some documentation for how to use pareview.sh. So if you haven't seen it, if you haven't ever contributed a module on Drupal.org, you might never have heard of this, but it's actually a really nice collection of tools that tests and kind of gives you hardening advice for Drupal modules and themes. You can basically drop your module into a folder and then run this test, which the instructions are in the documentation, and it'll tell you, there's 7 security issues, there's 25 code style issues, and it'll help you fix all those kind of issues and make your module and your code conform to the Drupal coding standards and security standards. So I think that's all I have, and apparently I didn't even practice this. I'm 2 minutes under, so any questions? Yeah.
Do you find, I don't know, like a year or so ago, when using Docker on a Mac, they recommended Docker Sync. Are you finding the newer versions you don't need that much?
Yeah, so I think it was 3 or 4 months ago, it might have been 6 months ago. My brain is a little scrambled this week from all the stuff I was working on, but I was following an issue in Docker for Mac's GitHub issue queue for a long time, and you mentioned the problem is that Drupal has thousands of files, and this problem also happens with VirtualBox sometimes. When there's thousands of files and PHP needs to look at all those files to compile itself the first time, or if you have opcache turned off or something, it has to do that every time, there's lots of file seeks. It has to open every single file, and if it takes 1/10 of a second per file, that's why it takes 10, 20, 30 seconds to load a Drupal page. So Docker had the same problem where its default shared file method took a really long time to load those files. But in Docker 1704 or 1706 or something like that, Community Edition now, that all has changed too in the past few months. It has two new file sync methods you can define. So when you define a volume that shares from your host into Docker, after the definition of the paths, you can add :RW for read write, comma, I think it's comma or colon or something, and then you can add either delegated or cached, I think. Delegated means that reads and writes will be managed through kind of a file cache system internally in Docker. And then cached, I think, just caches the reads, I think. So the writes would still be slow. So one note there is that the delegated part is not fully implemented. So if you're writing lots of files inside of Drupal, inside of a Docker container on Mac, and I think maybe Windows too, but I think it's mostly on Mac, it'll still be really slow. So if you're using Docker on a Mac and you have a shared volume and you don't have a really customized setup with some special tool for the sharing of files, don't run composer commands because they'll take like 20 minutes instead of a minute or two. But yeah, the problem is mostly fixed now, at least for loading sites. If you need to do things like Composer, you still want to avoid doing it inside a Docker container.
So they've been using Docker Sync.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Docker Sync kind of solves that problem the same way, but the nice thing now is it's in Docker core, so you don't have to tell people also add this thing to your project. Any other questions? Yeah.
What are your thoughts on Amazy.io's Lagoon project?
I've only glanced at it, so I can't give any good opinion on it. I know Amazy has had a lot of really awesome contributions. Like they had some of the best Docker documentation of how to do different things with Drupal, and they have some really nice Docker images that can be really helpful. I just haven't, I read through it and I looked at it, it looks impressive, but I just haven't had time to download it and actually kick the tires on it. So it looks really cool, and I mean it works for them, so it does work, so that's cool too, but it does seem like it's overkill, I think, for a lot of what I want to do a lot of times. If you're building a platform as a service, it's not overkill. But it's the same thing, like I don't run Kubernetes just to run a local development environment. Kubernetes is meant for larger scale, containerized application deployment.
Have you done anything with traffic?
I haven't, no, but that's another one of those things where I'm still waiting a little bit more to see if, to me, that kind of functionality, the DNS routing and discovery and all that, that should be built into Docker more.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking it will be at some point, so.
Yeah, I'm using I pronounced it Wobi, but I know you pronounce it different.
Yeah, I don't know. I just say Wabi.
They've got the, whatever, but they use traffic, so I got a single traffic container and firewall pole.
Yeah. Yeah, and like if you're using, like I said, Drupal VM is not doing it the Docker way. It's doing it a way that works.
Right.
Which is a kind way of saying it. It's totally eschews all Docker, and
Yeah,
it's
right now I'm the only one in the shop doing Docker because everybody else is still on Drupal VM.
Yeah.
Playing with Docker to see.
Yeah, and I mean the other thing is for a person like me, I do use Docker a lot now for a lot of things, but I'm not going to migrate Drupal VM into Docker until it's to a point where I think people can really easily use it out of the box, because something like is it Trafic or whatever, however you pronounce it, like something like that is basically DNS and service discovery all wrapped into a magic container. So I don't want to put that out there and then everybody's like, I don't know what this is doing, and something's weird in my corporate proxy, I can't get my local environment. I've had a lot of issues in Vagrant with that, but Vagrant has all these plugins that already solve all those issues. However you pronounce it.
I built a robo command that will add remove networks to traffic when you start to stop the machine.
Yeah, and I mean, the other thing is, if you, like, on your team, you can do these things, and then you can
Right.
kind of pave the way. If you don't have somebody on your team that can kind of be that kind of DevOpsy lead, where you help people with the ironing out the wrinkles right now, it's harder, and you start running into roadblocks. But if somebody's interested in it, if somebody can kind of move forward, Drupal VM itself, I worked for Mercy a few years ago. There's a couple guys from Mercy here, and the whole reason Drupal VM exists is because we're all like 2 guys on Windows, 1 on a Mac, 1 on Linux, and all of us had different environments, and we needed solar and all these things. So I was like, why don't we just like make a virtual machine for it? It's the same way with Docker. People are finding like it's really it's faster to develop with Docker, but there's still some wrinkles. Drupal VM, when it was early on, it didn't work very well for most use cases. It was basically just for our use case, and it started as 1 shell script, and then it became like 20 shell scripts. It became a really janky Ansible playbook, and then over time it's evolved into now being a lot more flexible. I want to do that for Docker too, and maybe not even using Docker images I maintain, but making sure that each of the Docker images works well together and is composed really well. And like that's why I mentioned Wodeby or Wadby. I think they have a pretty good ecosystem, and that's the kind of thing that I would want to do.
The only thing that I'm finding is they don't natively support SSL. You've got to use traffic SSL to route through.
Yeah, and like SSL always throws wrenches everywhere. And now that like with hosted Apache Solr and with Server Check-in and with some other ones, I have HSTS turned on, which it means that once you visit the website, it says all visits to this domain forever, everywhere have to be secure. So that means in your local development environment, you have to have a certificate, otherwise it won't load. So because of that, you need to have SSL in your local. And as you mentioned, that can be difficult with some of the Docker setups. It's difficult enough with Drupal VM in VirtualBox, because you still need to like either use Let's Encrypt or do something else and get a certificate and then use that. But it's more difficult when you have proxies like what Traffic is doing.
As a praise to Drupal VM, I needed to test a integration with Salesforce. So I used our wildcard certificate from our dev machine, put it into Drupal VM, and used like ngrok, where you can map back to your local machine.
Yeah.
And so I had a valid SSL certificate running in Drupal VM through ngrok back to my local machine for testing Salesforce integration.
Yeah, ngrok is incredibly useful. Like there are a lot of times when you're building an API thing, like I use Stripe, and when I'm debugging with Stripe or PayPal or something, I need to have SSL and I need to have a public domain that it can hit. So I use ngrok a lot for that. If you haven't ever tried it, it's really cool. It's also highly insecure if you don't use it the right way. You're not trying to run a website off your local computer, but if you need to have someone else hit your environment, or if you need to test an API or something, it's hugely useful.
Yeah.
All right, well that's all I got, and I think we're going to pause and let whoever's coming in next set up. So thanks.
Thank you.